Ladies and gentlemen, it is my tremendous privilege and honour to introduce the Cyril Foster Lecture for 2024 and to welcome you all. The lecture this year is entitled On the Declining Success of Civil Resistance, and I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished speaker, Professor Erica Chenoweth. In a moment, Professor Nita Crawford will introduce Erica properly, but before then, I want to take the opportunity to reflect on the remarkable origins of the Cyril Foster Lecture. This is the university's principal annual guest lecture in the field of international relations. The first Cyril Foster Lecture took place in 1960. Since then, the university has hosted many personalities from the worlds of politics and policy, from prime ministers, foreign ministers to secretary generals of the United Nations and heads of major international organizations, as well as prominent academics. It's an impressive list of the who's who in the world of international relations and politics. Sadly, though, we know very little about Cyril Foster himself, except that he owned several small shops in and around London and lived and died in a caravan. Yet international peace was so important to him that he left a significant bequest to this university, even though he has no known connection with it. This bequest enabled the creation of this annual lecture series. The topic in his will for which the bequest was given was to discuss the elimination of war and the better understanding of the nations of the world. What an extraordinary individual. And I think we should all be both humbled and inspired by his vision and his commitment to peace. At a time when it seems that the world is tearing itself apart, I think it's fitting that we pay tribute to his wishes and aspirations for the world by setting time aside to contemplate and to learn from our distinguished speaker what more we can do to bring peace and justice to society. I now ask Professor Nita Crawford to come up and give a fuller introduction to the lecture.
Well, it is an honor and a pleasure to introduce Dr. Erica Chenoweth. Her lecture, of course, could not be more relevant to the world and to Oxford today. All around us, we see acts of protest and resistance, some nonviolent, such as petitions, resignations, marches, and occupations, some destructive of property and others violent. We want to know what drives people to nonviolent protest, how it can be effective, how it works, and why. We want to know what it is that makes democracy work. So all of these activities, including democracy, are not without risks. It takes courage to stand up and say something is right or something is wrong, that a better and more just world is possible. Protesters may be pepper sprayed, tear gassed, beaten, preemptively arrested, fired from their jobs, or blacklisted for years. They may be expelled from universities. They may be, as one senator was during the run-up to the Civil War, beaten in Congress in the United States. On May 4th, 1970, nonviolent student protesters of the Vietnam War were shot by members of the Ohio National Guard on the campus of Kent State University in Ohio in the United States. 11 students were wounded and 4 students were killed. This is democracy. It's messy. Now, Professor Chenoweth has a BA in political science and German from the University of Dayton and an MA and PhD from the University of Colorado. You've already read that Professor Chenoweth is the Frank Stanton Professor of the First Amendment at Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government, where she's also an academic dean for faculty engagement. In fact, I think it is possible that she's a bit overworked at Harvard. Professor Chenoweth is also affiliated with the Radcliffe Institute, the Divinity School, the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation, the Carr Center, the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and several other institutes and centers at Harvard. Professor Chenoweth also directs the Nonviolent Action Lab, which describes itself as a hub for activists, researchers, and others who share common goals around defending and advancing democracy. Chenoweth has spent the last 2 decades studying political violence and nonviolence. They're perhaps most well known for a book co-authored with Maria Stephan, Why Civil Resistance Works, the Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, that showed when and how civil resistance can succeed in changing policy. This publication won both a Best Book Award from the American Political Science Association and the Grawemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order. Chenoweth and Stephan began that book with a story. They talked about in November 1975 when Indonesia's President Suharto ordered the invasion of East Timor and how the people there conducted a guerrilla war resistance, and the Indonesian military crushed them with such violence that it killed almost 1/3 of the people of East Timor. But in 1988, an East Timorese youth movement started a series of nonviolent actions in East Timor, and the movement spread all over the world. The Suharto regime cracked down. They killed more than 200 nonviolent protesters in Dili. And if the history stopped there, we would say the movement had failed. Yet, as Stephan and Chenoweth show, the killing was the spark to intensified nonviolent protest. It took more than a decade, but East Timor finally achieved independence in 2002. As they say in their book, nonviolent campaigns achieve success through sustained pressure derived from mass mobilization that withdraws the regime's economic, political, social, and even military support from domestic populations and third parties. Leverage is achieved, they argue, when the adversary's most important supporting organizations and institutions are systematically pulled away through mass non-cooperation. That's a very important book, and I urge you all to read it. In addition, Chenoweth is the author of Civil Resistance, What Everyone Needs to Know, published in 2021 by Oxford University Press. And Chenoweth is a co-editor of the Oxford Handbook on Terrorism. So Erica Chenoweth is a keen observer of democracy, authoritarianism, violence, and peaceful processes. They've studied the interplay and interconnections between violence and nonviolence. And what Chenoweth studies is ultimately about the health of democratic deliberations and dialogue. In that spirit, there will be time for dialogue and questions after the lecture, but it is now my pleasure to welcome Professor Erica Chenoweth to Oxford to give this lecture.
Well, thank you so much, Nita, and thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to be visiting Oxford again on such a beautiful day, and I'm very impressed that you all chose to be in here rather than out there. I'm delighted to be in conversation with you and to talk about some important, I think, trends in patterns of civil resistance around the world and what that might tell us about where we are headed globally. So civil resistance is the application of a variety of tools of unarmed methods like protests, strikes, boycotts, stay-aways, go-slows, and other forms of political, economic, and social non-cooperation to achieve political goals against an opponent. It's been used all over the world in every single country. There's been at least one documented campaign of civil resistance according to that definition, for a huge range of issues, basically anything you can imagine. And today what I want to do is talk a little bit about 2 key trends that will motivate the rest of the discussion. 2 key trends that I've been paying attention to over the past few years by collecting data on the onset and outcomes of civil resistance campaigns, and then what that might tell us again about where we're headed. So the first trend is one about the onset of civil resistance movements. And the next slide that I show you is going to show you a chart that's based on a very specific scope condition, which is of maximalist campaigns of civil resistance and armed struggle in which there are at least 1,000 people observed participating. Now, the reason that I'm showing you that graph is because that is a particular subset of civil resistance campaigns that's relatively easy to compare across many, many different cases and over a significant time period. But I will also mention other data throughout the course of the talk that focuses on reformist campaigns, which are those that seek civil and political rights, short of, say, the full confrontation of the government in order to oust the incumbent national leader or achieve territorial independence. So the subset of data that I'm showing you now are maximalist civil resistance campaigns seeking either to oust the incumbent national regime or to achieve territorial independence. And as I mentioned, there are basically two different modes of struggle that are shown in this chart. One is primarily armed struggle, where the people engaged in resistance are relying on a variety of different lethal tactics with weapons, and primarily unarmed struggle or primarily civil resistance or nonviolent resistance. Many people use those terms interchangeably. And those are the ones in which the primary mode of resistance when people are mobilized is using protests, strikes, boycotts, and other methods of unarmed resistance. So what we can see from this chart, based on that database, is that we've seen a huge upward trend in the onset of these maximalist campaigns, particularly after the sort of end of the anti-colonial wave in the 1970s, and in the breakthrough wave of what some people call the third wave of democratization, that is the spread of democracy around the world. The campaigns that we've seen in the last 25 years are so numerous that they outnumber the campaigns that we saw in the previous century. So we're living in a time in which more people are resorting to civil resistance as their primary mode of struggle than they did during our entire previous century. And you can also see in this chart that the onsets of new armed insurgencies or armed struggles have been declining, and that's something that's been observed by other scholars, and I won't spend too much time talking about it today, except unless you want to talk about it during the Q&A. Now, this is the second trend. So the first trend is more civil resistance campaigns around the world than ever before. And as I mentioned, I also collect data on reformist campaigns, and they are also far more numerous than they have been in previous decades. So the second trend is on their outcomes. And let me first say that the way that these outcomes are defined is as achieving that maximalist outcome. So of ousting the incumbent national leader, so toppling a dictator, say, in the Philippines, or breaking through negotiations with the Communist Party in Poland to bring forth elections and then transitioning to democracy through the Solidarity Movement. Those are examples of success, what we would count as successful campaigns. We basically count them as campaigns that achieve their maximalist objective within a year of the peak of their mobilization, and they had to have a decisive impact on that outcome. Now, this is a very strict definition of success. Again, it's one that can be relatively easily compared across cases, and so is useful for that reason. There are many ways to critique it by focusing too narrowly on those discrete breakthroughs of success rather than on consolidating victory or successful transition to the new regime, et cetera. But for the time being, let's just all assume that's the metric that's easiest to compare across cases and look at this slide. So this is troubling trend number 2 that, in my mind, motivates a key paradox that will focus the remainder of my talk. And that key paradox is that just as we've seen nonviolent resistance, nonviolent civil resistance become the dominant and even highly popular and ubiquitous mode of struggle around the world, we've also seen a very dramatic decline, sudden and dramatic decline in the success rates of those movements. Now, a couple of other things before I move on from this. is to point out that this is not something that means that armed struggle has become more effective. In fact, both modes of struggle have been declining in their effectiveness over time, and there's no evidence to suggest that they're increasing their effectiveness in the last 2 years since these data were collected. But this is just to say that all modes of resistance, in a way, are losing their edge, even as we have a highly mobilized civil society worldwide. The second thing I'll say is that these are global trends. And one of my colleagues, an activist from a certain authoritarian country, was telling me that it dawned on him when he saw this slide that it wasn't just his movement making mistakes and winding up failing, because it was also happening to people in Hong Kong, it was also happening to people in Myanmar and Belarus. And so these are global trends, not just individual countries in which movements are mobilizing on the wrong playbook per se. There's something going on globally that is driving down these trends, in my opinion. So I'll say a couple of other things about this particular trend. The first is that it's actually worse than it looks. The reason is because in some cases where we have seen breakthrough successes in the short term, cases like Sudan in 2019, we've seen in very short order a counter-revolutionary attempt that itself succeeded and brought about the consolidation of an authoritarian power. In Egypt in 2011, likewise, we saw a breakthrough moment where there's an opportunity for democracy to emerge and to potentially consolidate. And within 2 years, that chance was also subverted by a coup. And then in Tunisia, we saw a lot of optimism about the possibility of this country emerging and consolidating as a democracy. And again, just last year, we saw in Alta Golpe that basically undercut that process. Longer term, we see that many of the sort of shining beacons of success, the iconic examples of successful civil resistance, have themselves also become subject to autocratic backsliding. So places like Poland, Hungary, the Philippines, Brazil, the United States, all of us have seen our own authoritarian movements or authoritarian challenges from below or above that take the shine off the success of prior civil resistance movements in those countries. Why is this a puzzle? Well, it's a puzzle because, on the one hand, as I've already mentioned, this is a more ubiquitous tactic, and you would only expect people to use the tactic if they expected it to work. So there's a mismatch between the expectations and the outcomes that we haven't seen in prior decades in such a serious way. The second reason it's a puzzle is that people expect it to work because they've been learning about how to make it work. One of my colleagues is a former member of the civil rights movement, and he said that when they were planning and strategizing their lunch counter campaigns in the 1950s in Nashville, that all they had to work with was Gandhi's autobiography and the Bible. And he said, those were our training tools. Now you all have the internet, you've got training manuals, you've got YouTube videos, you've got documentaries, you've got Hollywood features, like you know how to do it. And it's true, people around the world do know how to do it. And yet, they are being defeated at a rate that we have not seen since the 1920s. So, why is this important and what are the stakes? Let me offer a few with regard to the impacts on international peace. The first is what some people have said regarding the promise of civil resistance as a functional alternative to armed struggle. You might be familiar with the quote by John F. Kennedy that those who make peaceful resistance impossible make violent resistance inevitable. Now, I don't know about that in the sense that I don't know that there are automatic substitutes for one another. I have some qualms with this type of claim. But I will say that the more people hear the story and learn the lesson that civil resistance is no longer an effective tool, the more people will think of other ways to get what they want. And in fact, some governments, some kind of autocratic movements have thought this way, and that's part of why we've seen coups in different countries that have had popular support. The second implication for international peace is a more indirect one. in the sense that through the 20th century, the spread of civil resistance around the world was one of the primary drivers of different waves of democratization. That is to say, we probably wouldn't have seen as many breakthrough democratic transitions as we did over the past 80 years in the post-war period and beyond, if we hadn't seen so many people relying on the tools that Gandhi was developing and that King was developing and sharing with others around the world. And so because of that, if that tool is taken off the table, it's a pretty bad timing to have that happen. Because as many of you probably know, we're in something that many scholars call the third wave of autocratization, where there's more people living today in autocratic regimes than were living in autocratic regimes just 10 years ago. And the prospects, especially this year, of that increasing in profound ways because of how many elections are taking place around the country and how many autocratic leaders are running in those elections, having an ineffective tool to defeat them and defend democracy is a frightening prospect. And it leads, of course, to the scary idea of basically the world being overpopulated by autocratic regimes, which we know are more likely to engage in war on one another, are more likely to murder their own populations in huge numbers, and have a number of other different very concerning behaviors with regard to peace and justice. The other issue is that when civil resistance campaigns fail, or rather when they are defeated, it often does motivate people to immediately take up arms. And we need look no further than the case of Syria to see an example of that. So I think this is a very important question when it comes to international peace, and I think we should pay attention to it now. So the puzzle here is this paradox. Why has nonviolent resistance been increasing in its frequency at the same time as it's declining in its success? And to understand what I think is going on, I'm first going to take us back to trying to know why nonviolent campaigns were succeeding in the 20th century in the first place. Why did they become so prominent and so effective during that period? What do we know about when they work and when they don't? And then I'm going to talk about what looks different, especially in the past decade when we've seen this precipitous decline and the effectiveness of those movements. And I'll conclude with some reflections on where we should go from here. So this is a slide that presents what I'd say are some consensus findings in the field, some based on research by others like Charles Tilly, and some based on my own research and research with others that I've done. And there are basically four key factors that determine whether movements tend to succeed or not. The first is their ability to build and maintain a very large, very diverse base of participants and to keep momentum on their side. The second is, as Nita mentioned in her introduction, the ability to dislocate their opponent from its various sources of support, whether they are economic, social, business interests, security forces, civil servants, state media, cultural or religious authorities, and the like. The third thing that they do is they maintain discipline even as repression escalates against them. And the fourth thing they do is that they vary their methods so that they don't get bogged down in any particular tactic that becomes vulnerable to repression or co-optation. So let me walk through each of these 4 points with some concrete examples so that they come across more clearly. So it's not a sort of rocket science to suggest that the larger the movement, the more likely it is to succeed. This is a basic rule of elections, which is win more votes. Civil resistance campaigns are generally thought to be the same way. If you want to succeed, get more people on your side participating, right? And I will put an asterisk next to this and return to it at the end. But one of the ways that I would qualify this is that very large numbers of people participating in events that are, say, distant from one another, so once a year, a big rally or something like that, might not have the same impact as a series of building events, a sense of building momentum. And so my colleague Maria Belgioso and I thought, because of a comment from an activist actually, who said to me, do you think that momentum works the same way in civil resistance movements as it does in linear physics, in which momentum is just mass times velocity? And Margarita and I decided to look at whether we could approximate those values of mass and velocity for movements. And so what we did was we counted up in a number of different cases the number of people who are protesting on any given day in a whole country, and we multiplied that by, again, a sort of stylized approximation of velocity, which was the number of distinct protest events within the previous week, the previous 7-day period. And we simply multiplied them, and it turns out that it's a very good predictor of whether somebody will resign from power on any given day. So one of the things that is sometimes talked about is the so-called 3.5% rule. The 3.5% rule is the descriptive observation that there are very few, if any, governments that were able to withstand a challenge of their population in which 3.5% of the population was actively involved on a peak day. And what Margarita and I can show here is that they can withstand it if there are very few events, but not so much if that's part of very broad events, like there's a lot of momentum building. And of course, the more people who participate, the more likely it is to have an impact. So why is that happening? It's happening, we think, because of the pressure that it puts on these different pillars of support that are the sources of the opponent's power. So again, the main mechanism through which civil resistance campaigns work is not just a lot of people in the streets. It's by actually beginning to change the interest-based calculations of, the security forces whose job it is to maintain, the peace, to change the interest calculations of the business and economic community, who suddenly might think that actually it looks like I'm going to get more money if we go with what these people are saying than if I don't. It's with civil servants who walk out of their jobs because they can't bear to support the incumbent anymore. It's by third-party supporters, say, of countries that are engaging in abuses toward their own populations, like the East Timor example. And so basically, the pillars of support are the key mechanism through which we see these changes. Now, this is something that was theorized by Gandhi, but also by Hannah Arendt and Gene Sharp a couple of decades later. And the idea here was that there's no autocrat or no tyranny that isn't totally reliant on the cooperation, obedience, and help of people who reside in those pillars. So there's no such thing as a monolithic power. Every autocrat, every tyrant has to constantly refresh their power, and they do it through those pillars of support. So if movements are able to begin to dislocate them or divide them, then those regimes have far fewer resources and capacities to maneuver. So civil resistance is more about constraining the options and removing all of that room for maneuver from the autocrat than it is kind of forcing them to accept that there are people in the streets that won't go away. Concrete examples of this are like in the Serbian case during the so-called bulldozer revolution of 2000. There were hundreds of thousands of people who came to Belgrade in sort of the peak moment to demand that Slobodan Milosevic leave power after stolen elections. And people came from the countryside, they came from the towns and the cities to demand this. And there was a whole line of police who were stationed outside of the sort of presidential palace. And they actually got an order at some point to shoot live fire on the demonstrators. And the protest organizers knew this because they'd actually stolen a walkie-talkie and could hear it when the order came down, and noticed that none of the police were following it. They just were pretending they didn't hear it. So they just calmly walked through the police lines, and the police kind of stood aside, and they occupied the presidential building, where they actually found a number of different ballots that were pre-marked for Milosevic. So again, clear evidence of the fraud. And Milosevic fled the country and announced he was resigning to spend more time with his grandson. So this is a really important example because it shows the fragility of those sources of support. Many journalists and academics went to interview those police and say, why is it you didn't carry out the order to shoot when you got it? And they said things that were quite banal, like, I thought I saw my friend in the crowd, or I saw my cousin, I saw the guy who sells me liquor on Saturdays. I didn't want to shoot them because they were swimming in their own society and realized that their long-term interests lied with those in front of them rather than the guy behind them. So this doesn't always happen. It's sometimes the case, certainly, that there's intense repression. Indeed, there was in Serbia prior to that incident. But it's an example of how even these kind of micro-level personal relationships can be activated when there's very large and sustained and diverse participation, and that sense of momentum that builds an air of inevitability. The third factor that I mentioned is discipline, and this is more based on sort of doctrinal discipline, the ability to maintain people power even as repression begins to escalate, rather than succumb to the temptations to either fall into disarray and begin to use more improvised forms of violence, or to turn to armed struggle altogether. So these are just descriptive slides that show the breakdowns in outcomes according to whether campaigns are able to maintain nonviolent discipline or whether they begin to accommodate other tactics. So the issue here is that repression is meant to provoke them to get out of discipline. One of the primary tools of repression is to make people feel desperate and terrified, such that they have no other alternatives. But the fourth thing that successful movements do is that they anticipate the repression and they find ways to maneuver that keep the pressure on while reducing the exposure to risk of their participants. And the way that they do that is basically by shifting their methods between the lowest risks methods of, say, dispersal and methods of omission, which I'll explain in a moment, and the highest risks methods of concentration and commission. So what do these terms mean? Concentrated methods are those where it's basically a spatial distinction. People come to a particular space in very high numbers, and they engage in something they're not allowed to do. So a sit-in, a protest that stays in one place, a march, a teach-in, or deliberately seeking imprisonment are considered some of the most high-risk acts of commission that are concentrated, because they basically they deliberately confront the repressive apparatus of the state. Methods of omission that are concentrated are also available, and these can include things like turning one's back, doing a mass walkout or a work stoppage. They're still concentrated. People are in one place and so are somewhat vulnerable, but they can also leave, or they can find ways to deny that the episode was on purpose. Dispersed methods are those in which people go away from places they're expected to be. And there are basically two categories of dispersed methods. One is acts of commission, again, doing things that are transgressive against the law or against norms. And then dispersed methods of omission, which is withholding something that you're otherwise expected to do. And dispersed methods of commission would be things like developing alternative institutions. My personal favorite is the stay-at-home demonstration, which it turns out we all know we can do now because of COVID, so nobody has any excuses. The stay-at-home demonstration, the so-called casserole demonstrations that have diffused in different Latin American contexts where people also bang their pots and pans inside their homes. It creates a real cacophony that is impossible to ignore and also impossible to target. And then dispersed methods of omission, where you withhold things you're expected to do, are like coordinated electricity strikes or other types of energy strikes, which can be very devastating if the government controls all of the energy sector, for example. Stay-at-home strikes or consumer boycotts. So skillful nonviolent movements tend not to over-rely on any one of these methods, but instead find ways to sequence them so that they can maintain momentum and pressure while also providing plenty of opportunities for retreat and regrouping without giving up any of the political ground. So those are the 4 things that successful movements have effectively done. So what has it looked like in the past decade? Let's look at mass participation. Now, the average peak size of maximalist nonviolent campaigns has gone down from its peak in the 1990s, but it hasn't gone down to levels that would otherwise be concerning. And so the lesson I take from this is that actually what we're seeing is that mass protests or mass participation is not enough anymore. So it might have actually been enough at some point to generate those defections, but now just huge numbers of people engaging in mobilization looks so ordinary, and so just part of our contemporary milieu, that it doesn't present the same sense of urgency and crisis that it might have otherwise done when it was a surprise and when it was somewhat uncommon and when kind of generated a sense of common knowledge that things were different. The second, and I think even more impactful issue, is the issue of the decline of defections. And this is the trend that I point out that raises a very concerning issue about what autocratic regimes have been learning. So what we've seen is that over the past couple of decades in particular, a very steep decline in security force defections in particular. So security force defections would be that example that I raised about Serbia, where the police just decided not to obey an order. That's what counts as defections. It can also be cases where security forces put down their weapons and join a movement, or anything in between. And what we've seen is that there have been far fewer movements that have been able to elicit those defections. And when they do sometimes elicit the defections, the government has a backup plan. This is because, and many scholars of authoritarianism have been documenting this over the past few years, many autocratic regimes have been very effectively proofing themselves against these defections. And they've done so in a number of ways. Some of the key ways include fragmenting their security services, so creating new security services in which there are people who are very loyal, kind of placed in one, and there are people who maybe aren't as loyal, kind of either purged or put in a different arm that has far fewer powers and far fewer responsibilities. They will delegate repression to the most loyal of those bodies, and they will pay off that inner entourage with very good wages. They also have been engaging in training and political education about civil resistance and about the fact that the primary way that it wins is through defections. And so the political education looks something like this. They will say to their officers in training, protesters are going to come to you and your people, and they're going to try to get them to defect. That's a CIA plot to destabilize our country. Don't fall for it. And that is repeated over and over again to such an extent that we're just seeing far fewer episodes of the behavior of the kind that I mentioned before. It's also, by the way, a deeply polarizing rhetoric because it makes protesters look like enemies of the state rather than your neighbor's friends and the guy who sells you liquor on Saturdays. The third thing that they've been doing is using paramilitaries, mercenaries, or even foreign troops to conduct some of the worst types of repression. So for example, Saudi Arabia provided troops in Bahrain. Belarus has provided security advisors in Venezuela. Russia has provided troops in Kazakhstan. And these have all been to basically suppress uprisings that there was a concern that the sort of homegrown security forces would be unwilling to do. So we used to assume that defections were just sort of a function of large-scale mobilization, and we can no longer assume that anymore because adaptations have been made to prevent large-scale mobilization from inducing them. So what to do about this? Well, I think it just means that movements need to strategize about how to induce defections rather than just assuming they're going to happen. And to try to model this out, Zoe Marks, Andrew Hawking, and I, a couple of years ago, published a paper in which we developed a computational model to try to understand what are the impacts of 3 different civil resistance strategies on the ability of the movements to win. And the first strategy was a mass mobilization strategy, which is just get as many people as you can into the streets as fast as possible and hope for the best, that these defections will happen. The second strategy is what we call a pillar strategy, which means that the movements, instead of just trying to mobilize as many people as possible, they try to concentrate the political activities of the activists around the closest influential person in the society to them. So they're basically just protesting around a pillar in the hopes that that pillar will move. And then the third strategy is what we call an informed pillar strategy. And this is one where we basically tell the protesters in advance which pillars, in their view, are already the most wobbly. So they've got some sympathies maybe toward the movement, or they just don't like the autocrat for one reason or another, and concentrate their efforts on that pillar first. And the logic here was, can you create a pillar cascade, a defection cascade, which is really the goal here. It's not just to secure one or two big defections, it's to create that cascade. And I'm going to show you a really ugly, hard to read slide next. Isn't it terrible? But it's showing us something really important, and I'll walk you through it. So this is a slide that shows the probability of success of a campaign based on peak participation. And the black line here is the historical data. So this is basically trained on the historical data that I've just presented. It takes into account a whole range of factors about the regime and what its capacities are, and the movement and what its capacities are. And we look at the effective participation, and this is it. So that's the historical average. That's the average to beat, right? So the blue line is the mobilization strategy, the get as many people as you can in the streets as fast as you can and hope for the best. Now, this strategy is much poorer performing than the historical average if it doesn't work. So what does that mean? It means when you are able to get as many people as you can into the streets very quickly, it works pretty well. It works as well as any of the others. But that's very rare, and about 90% of our observations are right over here. And so that basically means it's a very risky strategy, and one that you can't count on. Now, the red line is showing the strategy of the pillar strategy, and that is where the movements are trying to concentrate their efforts around key influencers in the society. And this one is doing remarkably better. It's already beating the historical average, even at the smallest numbers of participants. But look at the green line. This is where movements have intel. They know in advance which pillar to try to target first. And with even the smallest numbers in the database, they're just blowing away all of the other strategies. So this suggests to us that movements that are basically operating in our contemporary terrain have to be much more deliberate and strategic, not only about how to plan their tactics, but how to do them in a way that expressly elicits those defections. And they need intelligence in order to do it. So the third trend is related to organizational discipline. And I won't spend too much time on this one, but it simply shows that there's been a rise in the sort of mixing of methods of both nonviolent and violent resistance over the past decade. And so we have far fewer instances of movements that are able to maintain that discipline when they're repressed than we used to. So what about tactical innovation and flexibility? So I think one of my big critiques of the digital age is that it's given us a false sense of capacity to mobilize very large numbers in a very short amount of time. And, you know, to be fair, there are enough of us in this room that if we wanted to mobilize an action together and we decided, you know, tomorrow we're going to do something, we get on our social media accounts and make it happen, we could probably get thousands of people to come. It's easy to mobilize very large numbers in a very short amount of time. But remember the first and second point, feet on the street does not success mean. So this is a false sense of capacity to impact an outcome at a time when actually what movements need is capacity to build leverage. And so I worry a little bit about the sort of incentives of the digital age when we want to be able to share on Instagram the remarkable photos of, in this case, 2 million people marching in Rio de Janeiro, actually over the prices of public transportation rising suddenly, in this case. We want to be able to show these remarkable photos, and they're what many people associate with civil resistance in their minds, but it's no longer the model that is producing the outcomes people want. And so I'll kind of wrap up this part of the discussion by pointing out a diffusion of a certain playbook that is now utterly familiar to basically anybody who's been involved in any movement anywhere in the world, but especially those involved in democracy movements facing down autocratic regimes over the past 10 years. And it includes some of what I've already discussed in terms of, mitigating the impacts of defections, but it also expands to issues around the ability of autocrats and other governments increasingly to manage the information environment, provoke violence from within the movement in ways that allow them to discredit the movements, and create and reinforce legal systems, both through new laws and harsh penalties that criminalize forms of protest and resistance that used to be deemed both legal and legitimate. Most importantly, I think, and this is what explains the global trend, is the dramatic ways in which governments have been cooperating with one another to share these lessons. And so, many of the activists that I talk with now share this sentiment that they feel now that when they're going up against their government, they're actually going up against a massive global coalition. And that is very difficult to do alone. It's difficult to do alone. So there are a couple of alternative explanations that I won't dwell upon, but I want to mention them for the sake of rigor. The first is the issue of, isn't it just that the regimes that are still left standing right now are some of the most stubborn and well-consolidated autocratic regimes in the world? My colleagues Steve Levitsky and Lucan Wei just wrote a book about the incredible durability of revolutionary regimes, especially those in Russia, Cuba, and Iran, and are simply saying, you know what, when you overthrow a government with a violent revolution and you successfully initiate a genuine social, political, economic revolution, that's really hard to undo, and those governments are going to be there for a really long time. And I think that there is some truth to the fact that some of the last ones standing at the end of the last century and the beginning of this have been some of the more durable regimes out there. But let's not forget that the Soviet Union actually did collapse at the end of the 20th century. Excuse me. And let's not forget that almost always country experts, when they are interviewed on TV about what's going to happen to this movement that's just, risen up in Egypt or that's just risen up in Sudan, they usually say, well, this is a very stable authoritarian regime. And they're usually right until the moment that fellow resigns. And then there's the argument, well, it was inevitable all along that regime was about to collapse, right? So this is an argument that works only really in hindsight. And when we know that no regime is, if you sort of buy the argument that no regime is permanent and no regime is monolithic, then it's very hard to say that durable authoritarian regimes will endure forever. The second big issue is the issue around the sort of retreat of the liberal international order. So is the problem that the rise of civil resistance occurred effectively under a different global regime, a global regime of human rights respect, a global regime in which there was some pretense of wanting to spread and share democracy around the world, and now those pretenses are destroyed, and everyone knows the real game. This could be true. My colleague Daniel Ritter wrote a powerful book about this called The Iron Cage of Liberalism, in which he argued that defections usually occur because of Western pressure around economic interests in the different militaries in which this obtains, and that if that pressure leaves, or if the sort of Western values that have been imposed on these countries are less, then we shouldn't expect them to behave in that way anymore. I think that there is a lot to this. But I also say, let's not overestimate the liberalism of the liberal international order. In fact, many of the most iconic cases of civil resistance campaigns winning, including in the Philippines, including in Chile, including in Indonesia, in Iran under the Shah, happened exactly against regimes that the United States was supporting and funding and backing up. The other issue, of course, is that the U.S. was always ambiguous and ambivalent at best about democracy support and commitment to human rights. So I think movements have always been operating under very difficult terrain. It may be that the terrain is changing more because of autocrats learning about the power of the technique, which they underestimated in the 20th century, and that we now need movements to adapt to. The third potential alternative explanation is one related more to this phenomenon of revolutions. This is a term that Timothy Garton Ash and later Asif Bayat have been using to describe this phenomenon of sort of urban protests that don't really have political or ideological projects attached to them, but instead generate breakthroughs that can lead to at least partial transitions, but not durable revolutionary moments. And I think that that is also a reasonably good description of what has happened lately, but it's also not a great description of what has happened to suppress those movements of late. And so it's at best an incomplete story. So let me move ahead to resolving the paradox. So I want to mention first that most scholars that I talk to and many activists that I talk to don't think that there's anything wrong with the sort of fundamental theory of nonviolent action, but they think that it needs attention to several crucial issues that these four factors leave out. The first is an upgraded strategy on eliciting defections and ways for movements to think about that. In particular, thinking about eliciting economic and business community defections rather than over-relying on the idea that security forces are sort of the end-all, be-all, particularly around issues in which the economic sector is actually more important and more powerful than the security forces. The second is the issue of recalibrating tactics and messaging in a deeply polarized era, where there's real concern about the sort of incentives of the digital age to promote viral content that is extremely divisive, and movements needing to think more broadly and holistically about their information ecosystems and winning the information struggle. And one way to think about doing this is appropriating new technologies. There's a reason to think that we should be very worried about AI and the sort of panopticon. And I've heard a lot of doom and gloom from a lot of activists everywhere in the world about the panopticon of late. But there are also ways to appropriate those tools to help movements. In particular, as I've mentioned, some of the most difficult tasks for movements involve developing strategies about eliciting defections, doing pillar analyses, and having those informed in a good way. And there are lots of things that AI tools can do that can make those things much easier and much less risky to carry out. For example, different types of intelligence gathering or strategic coaching. One of my research assistants in my lab is half my age and practically an AI native at this point and had ChatGPT on her computer. And we were sitting around having a brainstorm meeting, and we said, we wonder what AI could do for social movements. Why don't you ask ChatGPT? And she types it in. And then it spits out about 30 single-spaced pages of amazing ideas, right? So we shouldn't emphasize the utility of these tools, but we also shouldn't underestimate them, especially when they're able to provide some useful tactical and strategic coaching in ways that movements find hard to get right now. So I think that the other thing that many people are coming to terms with and are trying to think through how they can improve these things are first of all about how to better learn and organize on the movement side. So if the problem is that movements are basically facing a global architecture of a repressive apparatus that is pretty good at crushing them or preventing them from being successful. There is no corresponding global network of movements that are sharing what they have learned and what they can bring to the table to resist that network. And so having some leadership about this and some good organizing would be vital to meeting the task. The second issue is one about the ability to better plan strategies rather than just tactics. My impression of many movements around the world and what has been shared with me by many activists is that most of the toolkits and handbooks that my colleague was telling me we have access to now are mostly about tactical work and not so much about organizing and not so much about strategy. And what is needed is organizing and strategy. And so if we could get some more thinking and more cooperation there, then the tactics would flow from those strategies. And so I really am very interested in convening more conversations about this and sharing lessons, both from scholars and activists alike, and hope you'll join me in that effort. So with that, I will close with my formal remarks and very much look forward to the Q&A.
Well, thank you. My name is Petra Schleiter, and I'm the joint head of the Department of Politics and International Relations here at the University of Oxford. And on behalf of the department, I would like to express our sincerest thanks to you, Professor Erika Chenoweth, for your brilliant and thought-provoking lecture. I think we've seen from the range of questions that we got here tonight just how much you got the juices flowing. I would also like to express our thanks to the Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Dr. Sir Michael Jacobs, for his kind welcome and introduction to the lecture, and to Professor Nita Crawford, who's our Montague Burton Professor of International Relations, for so masterfully managing the Q&A. While we know so little about Cyril Foster, I think we can guess why, and I quote, "the elimination of war and the better understanding of the nations in the world was at the forefront of his mind." Cyril Foster lived through the start of the Cold War, and although he died before the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, he and his generation witnessed the struggle between the superpowers and the clash of ideologies, all under the threat of nuclear annihilation. That was perhaps what is perhaps striking is that Cyril Foster's response to this defining crisis of his age was that he chose to endow a lecture series at the University of Oxford, about which, or with which, as we heard, he didn't have much of a connection. I think it speaks to the power of ideas and to the importance of research and education, and to Oxford's long-established and enduring commitment to addressing the world's greatest challenges. Now, almost 65 years after the inauguration of this lecture series, Professor Chenoweth shows us not only the increasing popularity of nonviolent civil resistance as the most common form of mobilization used by revolutionary movements, but also its declining effectiveness. Nonviolent campaigns today are succeeding less often than their historical counterparts, and that despite the fact that the causes that power these movements arguably are becoming increasingly relevant in light of the global populist and authoritarian turn that we are currently witnessing. Now, we ask ourselves difficult questions about the challenges that we face because we believe we can help to answer them. And Professor Chenoweth's lecture today and their long career as a distinguished academic, author, and director of the Nonviolent Action Lab reflects that. Please join me in thanking Professor Chenoweth again.